The Pearl, page 11. And the newcomers, particularly the beggars from the front of the church, who were great experts in financial analysis, looked quickly at Juana's old blue skirt, saw the tears in her shawl, appraised the green ribbon on her braids, read the age of Kino's blanket and the 1,000 washings of his clothes, and set them down as poverty people, and went along to see what kind of drama might develop. The four beggars in front of the church knew everything in the town. They were students of the expressions of young women, and they went into confession, and they saw them as they came out and read the nature of the sin. They knew every little scandal and some very big crimes. They slept at their posts in the shadow of the church so that no one crept in for consolation without their knowledge. And they knew the doctor. They knew his ignorance, his cruelty, his avarice, like extreme meanness, his appetites, his sins. Is that a reference to his appetites? Maybe he doesn't always just take pesos for payment? And then to follow that up with sins. They knew his clumsy abortions and the little brown pennies he gave sparingly for alms. They had seen his corpses go into the church. And since early mass was over and business was slow, they followed the procession, these endless searchers, after perfect knowledge of their fellow men, to see what the fat, lazy doctor would do about an indigent, extremely poor, like dirt poor baby with a scorpion bite. The scurrying procession came at last to the big gate in the wall of the doctor's house. They could hear the splashing water and the singing of caged birds and the sweep of the long brooms on the flagstones. And they could smell the frying of good bacon from the doctor's house. Kino hesitated a moment. This doctor was not of his people. This doctor was of a race which for nearly 400 years had beaten and starved and robbed and despised Kino's race, and frightened it too, so that the indigent came humbly to the door. And as always, when he came near to one of this race, Kino felt weak and afraid and angry at the same time. Rage and terror went together. He could kill the doctor more easily than could talk to him, for all the doctor's race spoke to all of Kino's race as though they were simple animals. And as Kino raised his right hand to the iron ring knocker in the gate, rage swelled in him, and the pounding music of the enemy beat in his ears, and his lips drew tight against his teeth. But with his left hand he reached to take off his hat. The iron ring pounded against the gate. Kino took off his hat and stood waiting. Coyotitu moaned a little in Juana's arms, and she spoke softly to him. The procession crowded close to better see and hear. After a moment, the big gate opened a few inches. Kino could see the green coolness of the garden and little splashing fountain through the opening. The man who looked out at him was one of his own race. Kino spoke to him in the old language. The little one, the firstborn, has been poisoned by the scorpion, Kino said. He requires the skill of the healer. The gate closed a little, and the servant refused to speak in the old language. A little moment, he said. I go to inform myself, and closed the gate and slid the bolt home. The glaring sun threw the bunched shadows of the people blackly on the white wall. In his chamber, the doctor sat up in his high bed. He had on his dressing gown of red watered silk that had come from Paris, a little tight over the chest now, if it was buttoned. On his lap was a silver tray with a silver chocolate pot and a tiny cup of eggshell china, so delicate that it looked silly when he lifted it with his big hand, lifted it with the tips of a thumb and forefinger, and spread the other 3 fingers wide to get them out of the way. So he's drinking like this, very daintily. His eyes rested in puffy little hammocks of flesh, and his mouth drooped with discontent. He was growing very stout, and his voice was hoarse with the fat that pressed on his throat. Beside him on a table was a small oriental gong and a bowl of cigarettes. The furnishings of the room were heavy and dark and gloomy. The pictures were religious, even the large tinted photograph of his dead wife who, if masses willed and paid for out of her own estate could do it, was in heaven. The doctor had once, for a short time, been a part of the great world, and his whole subsequent life was memory and longing for France. That, he said, was civilized living, by which he meant that on a small income he had been able to keep a mistress and eat in restaurants. He poured a second cup of chocolate and crumbled a sweet biscuit in his fingers. The servant from the gate came to the open door and stood waiting to be noticed. "Yes?" the doctor asked. "It is a little Indian with a baby. He says a scorpion stung it." The doctor put his cup down gently before he let his anger rise. "Have I nothing better to do than cure insect bites for little Indians? I'm a doctor, not a veterinary." "Yes, patron," said the servant. "Has he any money?" the doctor demanded. "No, they never have any money. I alone in the world am supposed to work for nothing, and I am tired of it. See if he has any money." At the gate, the servant opened the door a trifle and looked out at the waiting people, and this time he spoke in the old language. "Have you any money to pay for the treatment?" Now Kino reached into a secret place somewhere under his blanket. He brought out a paper folded many times. Crease by crease, he unfolded it, until at last there came to view 8 small, misshapen seed pearls, as ugly and gray as little ulcers, flattened and almost valueless. The servant took the paper and closed the gate again, but this time he was not gone long. He opened the gate just wide enough to pass the paper back. "The doctor has gone out," he said. "He was called to a serious case," and he shut the gate quickly out of shame. And now a wave of shame went over the whole procession. They melted away. The beggars went back to the church steps. The stragglers moved off, and the neighbors departed, so that the public shaming of Kino would not be in their eyes. For a long time, Kino stood in front of the gate with Juana beside him. Slowly, he put his suppliant hat on his head. Then, without warning, he struck the gate a crushing blow with his fist. He looked down in wonder at his split knuckles and at the blood that flowed down between his fingers. The town lay on a broad estuary, its old yellow plastered buildings hugging the beach. So if you think estuary, think lowland, and think the Spokane River is a river, right? And when it flows into the Columbia River, a couple miles before it flows into the Columbia, it splits into like 7 fingers of smaller river, and that they're all separated by little hunks of land that you probably can't build on, just kind of marshy. That's an estuary. And on the beach, the white and blue canoes that came from Nayarit were drawn up, canoes preserved for generations by a hard shell-like waterproof plaster whose making was a secret of the fishing people. They were high and graceful canoes with curving bow and stern and a brace section midships where a mast could be stepped to carry a small lateen sail. If somebody wants to do an image search for La Paz, Mexico, and see if you can find some of these colorful canoe pictures on the beach, that'd be great. Put it in the chat. The beach was yellow sand, but at the water's edge, a rubble of shell and algae took its place. Fiddler crabs bubbled and sputtered in their holes in the sand, and in the shallows, little lobsters popped in and out of their tiny homes in the rubble of sand. The sea bottom was rich with crawling and swimming and growing things. The brown algae waved in the gentle currents, and the green eel grass swayed, and little seahorses clung to its stems. Spotted botet, the poison fish, lay on the bottom in the eel grass beds, and the bright-colored swimming crabs scampered over them. Beautiful writing. Whew. On the beach, the hungry dogs and the hungry pigs of the town searched endlessly for any dead fish or seabird that might have floated in on a rising tide. Although the morning was young, the hazy mirage was up. The uncertain air that magnified some things and blotted out others hung over the whole gulf, so that all sights were unreal and vision could not be trusted. so that sea and land had the sharp clarities and the vagueness of a dream. I think yesterday I might have said Gulf of Mexico. No, it's the Gulf of California. Baja California is the peninsula, all the way down to Cabo San Lucas. Then the water in between Mexico and Baja California, the peninsula, is called the Gulf of California. Thus, it might be that the people of the Gulf trust things of the spirit and things of the imagination, but they do not trust their eyes to show them distance or clear outline of any optical exactness. Across the estuary from the town, one section of mangroves. Mangroves are like the plant that grows naturally at the edge of the water and helps to protect islands from being eroded. So mangroves are very important. When like people in Florida go in and rip out a bunch of mangroves so that they can put in housing developments, it really hurt Florida. Now Florida's got massive flooding problems because they're technically below sea level, most of it, or some of it. People weren't listening to the environmental scientists that say, do not get rid of those mangroves. Mangroves stood clear and telescopically defined, while another mangrove clump was a hazy black-green blob. Part of the far shore disappeared into a shimmer that looked like water. There was no certainty in seeing, no proof that what you saw was there or was not there. And the people in the Gulf expected all places where they were that way, and it was not strange to them. A copper haze hung over the water, and the hot morning sun beat on it and made it vibrate blindingly. The brush houses of the fishing people were back from the beach on the right-hand side of the town, and the canoes were drawn up in front of this area. Kino and Juana came slowly down to the beach and to Kino's canoe, which was the one thing of value he owned in the world. It was very old. Kino's grandfather had bought it from Nayarit, and he had given it to Kino's father, and so it had come to Kino. It was at once property and source of food. For a man with a boat can guarantee a woman that she will eat something. It is the bulwark against starvation. And every year Kino refinished his canoe with the hard shell-like plaster by the secret method that he had also come to him from his father. Now he came to the canoe and touched the bow tenderly as he always did. He laid his diving rock and his blanket and 2 ropes in the sand by the canoe, and he folded his blanket and laid it in the bow. Juana laid Coyotitu on the blanket, and she placed her shawl over him so that the hot sun could not shine on him. He was quiet now, but the swelling of his shoulder had continued up his neck and under his ear, and his face was puffed and feverish. Uh-oh. Juana went to the water and waded in. She gathered some brown seaweed and made a flat, damp poultice of it, and this she applied to the baby's swollen shoulder, which was as good a remedy as any, and probably better than the doctor could have done. But the remedy lacked his authority, because it was simple and didn't cost anything. The stomach cramps had not come to Coyotitu yet, or Coyotitu. Perhaps Juana had sucked out the poison in time, but she had not sucked out her worry over her firstborn. She had not prayed directly for the recovery of the baby. She had prayed that they might find a pearl with which to hire the doctor to cure the baby, for the minds of people are as unsubstantial as the mirage of the Gulf. So there's a praying reference. This whole back and forth, native Christian. So are you starting to see how this plot is setting itself up? So he had 8 crappy seed pearls. So a cultured pearl is cheap, and you take a seed pearl, which is like a little bit bigger than a grain of sand, and you stuff it into the oyster that is in your laboratory, and then the oyster will create layers over it, and then but then you got to call it cultured, so it's not worth as much. A real one that's made in nature, those can be different colors than white, and they are worth thousands of dollars even today. So like if you're at a secondhand store and you see something that's pearl and you're thinking like Mother's Day or whatever, ask to see it, and then kind of be sneaky about it, but rub the pearl on your teeth. It should feel like sand, gritty. And so sometimes you can score on those, like people that don't know and they have like a string of pearls just on the, not in the cabinet, but like on top of the cabinet because they're just like cheap costume jewelry. And grab those pearls and see if they're real, dude. You can make some major scores that way. But then it's kind of gross too. Now, Kino and Juana slid the canoe down the beach to the water, and when the bow floated, Juana climbed in, while Kino pushed the stern in and waited beside it until it floated lightly and trembled on the little breaking waves. Then, in coordination, Juana and Kino drove their double-bladed paddles into the sea, and the canoe creased the water and hissed with speed. The other pearlers were gone out long since. In a few moments, Kino could see them clustered in the haze, riding over the oyster bed. Light filtered down through the water to the bed where the frilly pearl oysters lay, fastened to the rubbly bottom, a bottom strewn with shells of broken, opened oysters. This was the bed that had raised the King of Spain to be a great power in Europe in past years. So this bed helped Spain build its empire. Great power in Europe in past years, had helped to pay for his wars, and had decorated the churches for his soul's sake. The gray oysters with ruffles like skirts on the shells, the barnacle-crusted oysters with little bits of weed clinging to the skirts, and small crabs climbing over them. An accident could happen to these oysters. A grain of sand could... So here's how an oyster makes a pearl. By accident, a grain of sand could lie in the folds of muscle and irritate the flesh until its self-protection, the flesh coated the grain with a layer of smooth cement. But once started, the flesh continued to coat the foreign body until it fell free in some tidal flurry or until the oyster was destroyed. For centuries, men had dived down and torn the oysters from the beds and ripped them open, looking for the coated grains of sand. Swarms of fish lived near the bed, to live near the oysters thrown back by the searching men, and to nibble at the shining inner shells. But the pearls were accidents, and the finding of one was luck. A little pat on the back by God, or the gods, or both. There's a reference to God versus gods, or both. Kino had 2 ropes, one tied to heavy stone and the other to a basket. He stripped off his shirt and trousers and lay his hat in the bottom of the canoe. The water was oily smooth. He took his rock in one hand and his basket in the other, and he slipped feet first over the side of and the rock carried him to the bottom. So he's using the rock as a weight. The bubbles rose behind him until the water cleared and he could see. Above the surface of the water was an undulating mirror of brightness, and he could see the bottoms of the canoes sticking through it. Kino moved cautiously so that the water would not be obscured with mud and sand. He hooked his foot in the loop on his rock, and his hands worked quickly, tearing the oysters loose, some singly, others in clusters. He laid them in his basket. In some places, the oysters clung to one another so that they came free in lumps.